Hello everybody, this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc. We're going to spend a little bit of time today, maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes, talking about a new program or an enhanced program, the Cylindrical Master 2020. So it's a much improvement over the previous Grinder's Toolbox, which some of you maybe were familiar with before. If you've taken my class, my high intensity grinding class, you received a copy of the Grinder's Toolbox. If more recently, if you've taken one of my Zoom classes, you've received the Grinder's Toolbox. And during COVID, we enhanced it greatly, in particular the cylindrical plunge portion. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so this video will be of interest to people who are doing cylindrical plunge grinding, and I will talk about what that means. Does that mean cylindrical traverse? Does that mean centerless? Does that mean peel? It will be whether or not attending either my high intensity grinding course, which hopefully after COVID will get going again, or one of my Zoom courses, which is going on in spite of COVID. So we're doing another round here in about 2 weeks, another round of Zoom courses, and we're doing a Zoom course specifically for the cylindrical plunge grinding. And if you attend that Zoom course, you will get a copy of the Cylindrical Master 2020, and this video should help you decide whether or not the Cylindrical Master 2020 will be of benefit to you. So COVID has changed everybody's lives. It changed my life. Somewhat. I think I was lucky that it didn't change it drastically. A lot of people suffered greatly during COVID. I suffered only a little bit, or not too much, fortunately. Did change my work a little bit. I didn't have any company visits. I didn't have any grinding courses. Didn't have any time on the shop floor. But that was okay because it enabled me to do other things. So it enabled me to drastically improve the Cylindrical Master 2020, which we're going to talk about today. So I had a lot of extra time during COVID. I did a lot of barbecuing. I have a nice new barbecue, and so I spent a lot of time barbecuing brisket. I got an injector. We were injecting brisket with various concoctions. We did mollejas, that's always a favorite. Chicken, jerky chicken, jerky venison. A buddy of mine gave me some elk meat and some bison meat, so we made jerky out of that. Did lengua twice. That turned out just okay. I don't think we marinated quite right. But my point of all this is, I spent many days barbecuing, and then I would fire up the barbecue in the morning, and then I would work on the Cylindrical Master 2020 for an hour, and then my reward, if I made good progress during that hour, is that I could go check on the barbecue and see how it was doing. And that was nice for briskets that can take 16 hours, jerky can take 2 days, depending. And then in the evening, after working on the Cylindrical Master 2020, I would treat myself to a bottle of red wine and the barbecue of the day. So the downside was, well, the upside was I made a lot of barbecue. The downside was I gained about 15 pounds. But the upside is that we have an incredibly useful tool in the Cylindrical Master 2020. And I say that optimistically but cautiously. It's an incredibly useful tool if you know a little bit about grinding and if you know what the hell you're doing. The old garbage in, garbage out. So please, if you're going to use the Cylindrical Master 2020, you need to attend my class to get it, but please know a little bit about grinding before you tear into it. Okay? But if you know a little bit about grinding and you know what you're doing, it's an enormously useful tool for decreasing cycle times, decreasing your burn risk, decreasing cycle time while not increasing your burn risk, dealing with chatter, and just dealing with day-to-day issues. If I want to reduce wheel wear, if I want to reduce temperatures because I'm worried about burn, if I'm worried about chatter and if I want to reduce that risk, various things depending on what you want to do. So we will go through all of those during this 30-minute, 45-minute class. We'll see how it goes. And we will talk about cylindrical plunge grinding. And then I'll walk you through the Cylindrical Master 2020. We'll have a couple case studies where we look at case studies of cylindrical grinding and say, okay, what's going on? If we want to reduce wheel wear, what can we do? If we want to reduce temperatures, what can we do? If we want to reduce cycle times while not having anything bad happen, what can we do? If we want to do all of those things, well then what can we do to mitigate risks? So that's what I'll be talking about in this video. And I will walk you through the Cylindrical Master 2020. Again, we have a Zoom class coming up, a cylindrical. We have various Zoom classes and various Zoom grinding dock lunches. But one of those Zoom classes is a one-day course on cylindrical plunge grinding. And if you attend that course, you will spend a whole day learning about cylindrical plunge grinding, and you will receive the tool of the Cylindrical Master 2020, which, like I said, can do marvelous things if you know what you're doing. Okay? So let's talk about cylindrical grinding, and when I say cylindrical grinding, I mean cylindrical plunge grinding. So here's a chunk of steel. Here is a aluminum oxide grinding wheel. All of this applies to aluminum oxide, silicon carbide, CBN, and diamond. And we can break cylindrical grinding down into various types. So the first type, let's get this out of the way, is centerless grinding. What I'm going to talk about today does not apply to centerless grinding. Centerless grinding is a completely different animal. So if you're a centerless grinding guy, this course will not help you. Okay. Number two, cylindrical traverse grinding. Cylindrical traverse grinding is where you take a depth of cut, doink, and then you traverse across the workpiece while the workpiece is rotating. Take another depth of cut, maybe on the part, maybe off the part, doink, doink, doink. Maybe you're a double doinker, doink, doink, doink. Maybe you're a single doinker, doink, doink. That is cylindrical traverse grinding. That's a completely different animal too. What I'm about to talk about does not apply for that. Now, another option is peel grinding. Peel grinding is where you take usually a small wheel that has a taper on it. This one doesn't have a taper. And there are two types of peel grinding. There is traditional peel grinding, and then there's pinch peel. Traditional peel grinding is just where we traverse, but we have a taper, so it's a little bit different than cylindrical traverse. And then we rotate the workpiece super fast. That's peel grinding. What we're going to talk about today does not apply. The other one is pinch peel grinding, where typically we swivel the wheel quite a bit. We have a roughing wheel and a finishing wheel, and then we go like this, and then we put funky radiuses and chamfers and tapers and stuff. What I'm going to talk about today does not apply to pinch peel grinding. What it applies to is plunge grinding. And that can be plunge grinding in OD or plunge grinding in ID. It applies to both. And that's basically where the wheel just plunges into the workpiece while the workpiece rotates. There's no oscillation. Now granted, you can do plunge grinding with oscillation during, or plunge grinding with some wiping, you might call it, after. But what we're talking about applies to a plunge at some speed, usually millimeters a minute, inches per minute, millimeters per rev, if you want to do it that way, while the workpiece rotates. So that's what I call cylindrical plunge grinding. And that's what applies for what we're going to talk about today. And that applies for aluminum oxide, applies for CBN diamond, it applies for CBN diamond, diamond on carbide, CBN on steel, CBN on nickel alloys, stainless steels, aluminum oxide and nickel alloys, stainless steels, whatever you got. So the material of the workpiece and the material of the wheel are material things, but what I'm talking about is geometry, and this geometry of cylindrical grinding applies to pretty much all materials. Now, we can also do cylindrical plunge grinding with some kind of funky, it's not even that funky, let's just say swivels. So what we have there is we typically have a wheel with a 30-degree angle. Although that wheel 30-degree angle can be anything. I had a nice crankshaft that I used to use during these demonstrations. And I was in Colombia in December and January. And then when I was coming back, the immigration security guys at the airport thought my crankshaft could be a weapon. So they took it from me. So I no longer have my crankshaft. I haven't had time to get a new one. But I found a basic screwdriver or a basic tool that will illustrate the purpose here. And what we have is a wheel that is swiveled. Typically it's 30 degrees, but it can really be anything. We have a 30-degree swivel. And then what we do is we plunge in. We can plunge in at 30 degrees, we can plunge in at 5 degrees, we can plunge in at 80 degrees, depending on your machine's capabilities. All are possible. And then what we have is grinding on the OD over here. And then we have grinding on what's typically called the shoulder, or occasionally the, drawing a blank here, sidewall. So typically the shoulder or the sidewall. Okay, and they're two, even though they're done the same operation, what happens on the shoulder is vastly different than what happens on the OD. And this can drive you crazy because you're striving to get, not burn over here, but not too much wheel over there. And how do you control all these and how do you manipulate it? The grinder toolbox will help you do that. Okay, so that's cylindrical plunge grinding with a swivel on the wheel. And then there's just straight up cylindrical plunge grinding with no swivel on the wheel. Now occasionally we have to deal with this shoulder grinding, but with no swivel. That is pain and suffering. If you take my cylindrical grinding course, you will learn how to cope with that pain and suffering. But the Cylindrical Master 2020 will help you deal with the grinding operation that occurs on the OD. It doesn't help you deal with the grinding operation that occurs on the shoulder, because in fact there is no grinding that goes on the shoulder. It's just rubbing and potential burning. So what we're going to talk about is right there. If you want to learn how to deal with that shoulder burn, take the course. We talk about that in detail. Okay. So that's what we're going to get into in the cylindrical, this 30-minute, 45-minute discussion about the Cylindrical Master 2020. So I'm going to fire up the spreadsheet, the Cylindrical Master 2020. But before we do, we're going to do a little fundamental introduction, background information, because I want you to understand just some of these basic concepts and make sure you got a handle on them before you dive in, or we're going to have a handle on some of these basic concepts before we dive in. So I'm going to give a short introduction to those things, but not a long introduction and not a long explanation, because if you want that, then you should take the Zoom course coming up, and then you'll learn about these concepts. And then if you really want to get deep into them and really understand them, you need to take the 3-day high-intensity grinding course. Okay? So let's go through some of these basic concepts. And then once we have just a cursory understanding of those, we will get into the Cylindrical Master 2020. So I'm going to give a little bit of background information to help you understand some of the concepts that you need to understand when you use the Cylindrical Master 2020. I'll just call it the Cylindrical Master from now on. So I'm going to touch on these subjects in a very basic format, and I prefer my customers, the end users, to understand them reasonably well, pretty well, before they jump in to using the Cylindrical Master. And you will receive that information if you attend my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, or if you attend the 1-day Zoom course on cylindrical grinding. Okay, so please do not take this as a thorough education on these concepts. Please take this as a short introduction on these concepts, just to help you understand what I'm going to be talking about in the Cylindrical Master when we get to it, the program, and we get to some of the case studies. So I break grinding into two types. There's cylindrical OD and there's cylindrical ID. The Cylindrical Master applies to both of these if it's plunge grinding. So there are some enormous differences between these two types of grinding, yes, but fundamentally the calculations are quite similar, and all the general concepts of temperature and grit penetration depth, aggressiveness, waviness all apply to both. But some of the fundamental differences between these two types are, number one, the arc length. In cylindrical OD grinding, you have a very short arc length. In cylindrical ID grinding, OD stands for outer diameter, ID stands for inner diameter. Outer diameter grinding has a very short arc length, and inner diameter has a relatively longer arc length. And then number two, there are issues of stiffness. In general, the spindle or the quill or the wheel, depending on how you look at it, the whole assembly is far less stiff in cylindrical ID grinding than it is in cylindrical OD grinding typically. And that has a lot of issues in terms of deflection, taper, barreling. It has a lot of issues in terms of chatter. And then that chatter is also coupled with the longer arc length. So, but this is what we divided into, and the Cylindrical Master applies to both ID and OD grinding. I've already discussed that Cylindrical Master does not apply to centerless grinding. It does not apply to peel grinding, pinch peel grinding, and it does not apply to cylindrical traverse grinding. Now, we do have a program for that, but it's a different program because these are completely different types of operations. So we break it down into cylindrical plunge grinding and cylindrical traverse grinding. Cylindrical plunge grinding is where the wheel just plunges into the workpiece as the workpiece rotates. Cylindrical traverse grinding is where we take a fixed depth of cut and then we traverse across that workpiece while we rotate that workpiece. Completely different grinding operation, and the Cylindrical Master applies to the top one, but not to the bottom one. Now, you have to have an understanding of aggressiveness or grit penetration depth. I'm going to talk about it briefly here. I would like you to have a much better understanding of it, and people who take my grinding courses say, yes, this is one of the most important and useful concepts in the course. Okay, if we talk about grit penetration depth first, grinding is a bit like milling in a sense, that theoretically that grit traces out a path, and that path, if we're doing up grinding, goes from some grit penetration depth, if you want to call it that, or you could call it chip thickness, chip load, some people call it. And if you're doing up grinding, that chip load goes from a value of 0 to some maximum value. If you want a ballpark number, just go with 1 micron as a ballpark number for the maximum grit penetration depth or chip thickness. If you're doing down grinding, the situation is really not too different. The only difference is that the grit goes from maximum to 0. It doesn't go from 0 to maximum, it goes from maximum to 0. So instead of going from 0 to 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.3 up to 1 micron, it goes from 1 micron to 0.9 to 0.8 to 0.7, etc., etc. Bigger grit penetration depth means we're going to have bigger forces on the grits and probably, not always, but probably more wheel wear. It means we are going to dig deeper and do more cutting and less rubbing, so probably generate less heat or we have to be careful with that, less heat per cubic millimeter that we remove. So we are more efficient if we have a bigger grit penetration depth. And it also has an effect on the temperatures because of the heat, like I just mentioned, and various other things. So we have to have a decent understanding of grit penetration depth. Larger grit penetration depth will give us a rougher surface finish, all things being equal, a higher RA value. Okay. Now we can change these things by changing the parameters. If we decrease the wheel speed, we get a thicker chip, a bigger grit penetration depth, a bigger chip thickness. And if we speed up the wheel, we get a smaller chip thickness. So some of the old time grinders will say, oh, I speed up the wheel to make the wheel act harder. And in some sense, you can think of it that way. The wheel acts harder because the grits do not dig as deep. So the forces on the grits are smaller, so they don't cause as much grit fracture and bond fracture to cause the grits to break out, and that gives us less wheel wear. Okay. I like the term aggressiveness. This gets a little advanced here. How do we differentiate between grit penetration depth and aggressiveness? I won't get into it here, but they are proportional to one another. They are more or less the same. And a higher aggressiveness or a higher chip thickness will give you all these outputs, you might say, or all the result that I list here. A lower aggressiveness will give you all the ones I list there. Okay, so a higher aggressiveness gives you larger forces acting on the individual grits. Typically it'll give you more wheel wear, not always. There are some caveats and some exceptions, but in general. The wheel will act softer, if you like to think of it in that respect. And because we have more wheel wear, the wheel is better self-sharpening. This is particularly true with ceramic SG style, Cubitron style grits. The grits do less rubbing and plowing and more cutting. Now that can be a good thing in rough grinding, can be a little bit of a bad thing in finish grinding, depending. It'll give us a lower specific energy. Specific energy is a concept we talk about in the course. It'll give us a poorer surface finish. Probably we should be careful with that term poorer, but we should say will give us a rougher surface finish and a higher RA value. And then for CBN and diamond, the wheel opens up or breaks down more quickly. So particularly with CBN, we get through that break-in period quicker. And then with lower aggressiveness, everything is just the opposite. Now we have to have an understanding of arc length, and this is particularly true for the differences between cylindrical OD and cylindrical ID grinding, and it's particularly relevant in terms of the aggressiveness or the grit penetration depth. So arc length, or the number of grits in the action. If we equate this to surface grinding, when I do creep feed grinding, for example, I take a deep cut with a slow feed rate, and I will have a lot of grits in the action because I will have a very long arc length. If I do shallow cut surface grinding, even if I have the same material removal rate and the same cycle time, because my arc length is smaller, because my my depth of cut is smaller, I will have fewer grits in the action. So those grits typically will dig deeper into the workpiece. Okay, so that has an effect, particularly between cylindrical OD grinding, which has a very short arc length, and cylindrical ID grinding, which has a longer arc length. And then it also has an effect on whether or not how I change the workpiece RPM. So a faster workpiece RPM in cylindrical plunge grinding gives me a shorter arc length. I don't get into that here, but that is important in term, and we talk about in the grinding course, whether you want to go grind more slow and deep or whether you want to grind more fast and shallow. The next concept is equivalent diameter. This gets a little complicated. If you get this, great. If you don't, you're probably going to be okay. But when we do all these calculations, what we do is we convert them to an equivalent in surface grinding. So we take cylindrical OD grinding and we say, okay, that is the equivalent of surface grinding with this particular wheel diameter. And if we're doing cylindrical ID grinding, we say, okay, that's the equivalent of surface grinding with this particular wheel diameter. Okay, and in general, when we do ID grinding with a wheel, the equivalent diameter is usually quite small. I'll show you the calculation for that, which means there aren't a lot of grits in the action. The equivalent diameter in ID grinding is much longer, meaning there are a lot more grits in the action. There's the basic calculation. If you get this, great. If you don't, it's okay. But it is good for understanding how we arrive at some of these calculations. Okay, so in cylindrical OD grinding, for example, if I have a 350 millimeter diameter wheel, 14 inches, and I have a 25 millimeter diameter workpiece, or 1 inch, that really, in terms of the grinding geometry and the number of grits in the action, is the equivalent of grinding with a 23 millimeter wheel, or roughly a 1 inch wheel. And that very, very small wheel will give me a very, very short arc length. Okay. Now, cylindrical swivel. Some grinding machines swivel their wheels various degrees, various angles. The most common will be 30 degrees, so you'll see a lot of those. A lot of the old Cincinnati cylindrical grinders swivel 30 degrees, and there is a very good reason for this, and it's an enormously beneficial thing to do if you are grinding a shoulder or a sidewall. Okay, so what we do is we take the wheel, we swivel at 30 degrees, and then we dress it. We dress it flat here and flat there, you might say. So we have 2 points of contact. We have the diameter right there, and then we have the shoulder right here. And what happens is the material removal rate, the grit penetration depth are vastly different here than they are there. Here and there being the OD versus the shoulder. So therefore this side can be more susceptible to burn. This side can be more susceptible to wheel wear. And typically what you do when you have burn is speed up the RPM of the workpiece. Typically when you have wheel wear, too much wheel wear, you slow down the RPM of the workpiece. So now we've got contradicting things we want to do to accomplish, and we have to take that into consideration. And that's one of the nice things about the Grinder's Toolbox, or the Cylindrical Master 2020, is that it does all these calculations, and then it allows you to manipulate to say, okay, well, I'm going to keep my swivel at 30 degrees, but if I'm capable, depending on the machine, I'm not going to plunge at 30 degrees, I'm going to plunge at 45 degrees. Or I'm going to plunge at 50 degrees, or I'm going to plunge at 10 degrees. Or I'm going to plunge at 30 degrees, but I'm going to manipulate my wheel speed, my workpiece RPM, my plunge speed, and maybe even the way I dress the wheel to get what I want. So we don't talk about it here, but we do talk about it in my courses, where we dress the wheel different on the shoulder than we do on the OD. In fact, I'm a big believer of doing that, and that can work wonders in terms of reducing your risk of grinding burn. In fact, you probably should do that if your machine is capable of it. And if your machine is not capable of it, you should investigate trying to make your machine capable of that. Straight grinding on a shoulder. Here things get painful. Here we plunge down right there, and what happens is all the grinding action occurs on the OD, and there's no material removal on the side of the wheel, and we have an incredibly big, nasty risk of burn right there. So the Cylindrical Master applies here. It does not apply there, because that's in a sense, it's a cylindrical traverse grinding operation. And we're getting outside the scope of the Cylindrical Master, but the solution there, or one of the solutions, that's a kind of a dirty, imperfect solution, but it works, is to relieve the side of the wheel. Okay. But everything we're going to talk about here is what goes on the OD, at least in terms of what we're going to talk about in the Cylindrical Master 2020. Okay, so now let's look into cylindrical plunge grinding. So when we do cylindrical plunge grinding and I plunge that wheel into the workpiece, what happens is as the workpiece rotates, I have an equivalent diameter, or excuse me, I have an equivalent depth of cut. And the equivalent depth of cut is the plunge velocity in millimeters per minute divided by the workpiece RPM. So what happens is all the grinding action is occurring right here on this surface. All the grinding action is occurring right here. And I can manipulate whether that depth of cut and therefore the arc length is long or short based on how I manipulate the plunge velocity, or usually more importantly how I manipulate the workpiece RPM. So if I speed up that RPM and I go say from 60 RPM to 120 RPM, then what happens is the number in the denominator gets bigger, so the overall number gets smaller, and I have a smaller depth of cut, and I have fewer grits in the action, and that has an effect on temperature, it has an effect on grit penetration depth and aggressiveness. If I slow down my workpiece RPM, and I go say from 60 to 30, now I'm going to have a deeper effective depth of cut, a longer arc length, and that's going to affect the grit penetration depth. There's also an equivalent surface speed. So now how fast does this workpiece enter the wheel is pi times the workpiece diameter, that's fixed, pi is definitely fixed, times workpiece RPM divided by 60. So if I speed up the RPM of the workpiece, I have an effective faster surface speed. So this gets into, are we grinding slow and deep, or are we grinding fast and shallow? And this will affect things greatly too. This will affect grit penetration depth, aggressiveness, temperature, chatter risk because of arc length and other things, and cutting stiffness. So it's important to understand this, even if you don't understand it perfectly, that we are effectively changing the depth of cut and the arc length and the effective speed just by changing the workpiece RPM. Okay. Next subject we're going to touch on very quickly. I get in a lot more detail in the grinding course, but integer values. When I give my course, I have everyone chant round number bad, strange number good, round number bad, strange number good. We don't want round numbers, we want strange numbers, and when I'm talking about the RPM of the wheel divided by the RPM of the workpiece. If we have a round number, let's say the RPM is, well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's say the wheel is going at 2400 RPM and the workpiece is going at 300 RPM. 2400 divided by 300 is exactly 8.0000. So what's going to happen is that wheel is going to come around. That wheel is not perfectly round because no wheel is perfectly round. That wheel is not perfectly balanced because no wheel is perfectly balanced. And we're going to get lobes on there, but if we have an integer value, we're going to keep getting the same lobe over and over and over again. But if we have a strange number, then we are going to obliterate. We're going to have what's called a phase shift. Again, I'm running through this very quickly. So we're going to have a phase shift, we're going to have a strange number, and we're going to end up with a workpiece that looks like that instead of a workpiece that looks like that. Even fractional numbers can be a problem. You get scallops there, and you get, it's not as bad because the scalloping chops things off. So I bring this up because we are going to look at this in the Cylindrical Master, and some of you guys who have battled waviness, I've had customers who have just battled waviness and pulled out their hair for months and months and years, and then once they understand this concept, boom, problem gone, easy to solve. So here's a Roundness profile, that's not bad. I call this kind of eggy waviness, and that's not so bad. Here's an actual measured roundness profile from one of my customers. It's kind of hard to believe, but look at that. We have what I call flowery waviness. Flowery waviness is very often caused by integer values, which the Cylindrical Master 2020 will give you. Okay, so that's my quick introduction. We'll get into some case studies next, but that is a quick introduction of some very, very basic concepts. Again, this is not an explanation of those concepts. This is a taste, a very cursory, basic overview so that you can understand some of the concepts in the Cylindrical Master. But if you're doing grinding, you're doing cylindrical grinding, you need to have a better understanding of that. You need to take either my 3-day high intensity grinding course or the Zoom course to cover all of these issues. Okay, so having said that, now let's get into some case studies. And a couple of these are straight from production companies I've been on the shop floor in. In fact, I think almost all of them are, where we've had issues in cylindrical grinding. And we have improved things or increased feed rates or reduced temperatures just by using the Cylindrical Master or the previous version, the Grinder's Toolbox, to improve things. Our first example will be just a basic plunge grinding, nothing complicated, quite simple, just to get you familiar with how the Grinder's Toolbox works. Those of you who have the Book of Grinding, I've read the Book of Grinding, you'll recognize the grinding dog here, who begins as an introduction to each section. So here we have the grinding dog to introduce our basic plunge grinding example. So let's start with just the basics. We've got a wheel. Now this is not drawn to scale, obviously. We've got a grinding wheel, aluminum oxide, 350 millimeters in diameter, running at 55 meters per second. So we don't know the RPM, we just know it's running at a velocity of 55 meters per second. It's a 100 mesh wheel in aluminum oxide. And we will talk a little bit about dressing and how we cope with that without knowing the signature characteristic aggressiveness versus, or specific energy versus aggressiveness curve. But to begin, we're going to go with a sharp dress, a medium dress, and then a dull dress. We're going to try all three. And I will talk about what that means in a minute. So we're plunging down at 1 millimeter a minute, and we're plunging into a hardened steel workpiece. Now that'll be relevant only for the calculation of temperature. Hardened steel has certain thermal properties, so we will use those for hardened steel. My workpiece is 25 millimeters in diameter, 1 inch in diameter. We're plunging down, and while we're plunging, we're rotating at 120 RPM. So the things we want to know are, what is my Q prime, what is my aggressiveness, what is my grit penetration depth, how is my waviness, what will happen if I increase my plunge velocity, what will happen if I decrease my plunge velocity, what will happen if I increase my workpiece RPM, what will happen if I decrease my workpiece RPM, what if I wanted less wheel wear, what if I wanted lower temperatures, what if I wanted to increase feed rates and not, little typo there, not have anything bad happen, not now have anything bad happen, not have anything bad happen, okay? So I've written those down. We're going to switch to Excel and we're going to put those in, and then we're going to play around just with some basics to see what happens. Okay, so here we have the Cylindrical Master 2020. I may accidentally call it the Grinder's Toolbox because that's the term I generally use for all my programs for looking at grinding, dressing, and cooling parameters. But this particular jazzed up version that we did during the COVID time, we call the Cylindrical Master 2020. Okay, so you're going to fire that up, and you're going to go to the introduction page, and you're going to be greeted by the Grinding Viking. And the Grinding Viking is going to say, "Welcome to the Cylindrical Master 2020. the wise grinder's choice for selecting optimum grinding parameters. It's nice to see you, Joe. How are the kids? Now, your name is Joe Grinder, whether you like it or not. When you actually get your own version, if you attend the course, it will be personalized to your name. But since I don't know your name, I am going to call you Joe Grinder, and that is going to be your name while we go through the Grinder's Toolbox. So you're greeted by the Grinding Viking. You type in your name. Oh, my name is Joe, and everything is good. Okay. You may get a different greeting depending on the day and depending on what kind of mood the Grinding Viking is in. If any of you have attended my course, you'll know that the Grinding Viking is not always polite. Okay, so then you're going to switch over to Cylindrical Plunge Master. So going back to our case study, let's begin putting things in. This is outer diameter grinding. So let's start with number 2, the plunge feed rate. Plunge feed rate is 1 millimeter a minute. The workpiece velocity, number 3, is rotating at 120 RPM. You got a couple different options. Surface feet per minute, meters per second, but we're doing RPM, which is the most common. And then after that, we've got the workpiece diameter, which is 25 mil. Now the diameter at the shoulder doesn't matter because we're not doing any shoulder grinding. The width of cut you can use, we probably are not going to need it here, but the width of cut is used to calculate deflection and push off and chatter risk, but we're not going to be dealing with that today, so we don't really need that. You can put in whatever value you want. You choose your units here, millimeters or inches. We have millimeters. Wheel diameter is 350, we've already got that, and the wheel speed is 55 meters per second. Could do RPM if we wanted to also. The wheel mesh size is 100 mesh, so we've got options here. We've got the various mesh sizes. 8 mesh, that's a bit extreme, you don't see that too often, but it's there. Going down, and then you've got the FEPA grit size for super abrasives. In our case, we've got 100 mesh, so let's go with that. And then the wheel, sometimes you turn it at swivel at 30 degrees, sometimes you feed at 30 degrees, sometimes you feed at 45 degrees, but for our basic calculation, we're going with a 0 degree swivel and plunging straight in. The wheel grit type, we've got a couple options. Aluminum oxide is what we have. And then we have this up here, and this can get a little complicated. If you want to be exact, this is used for the temperature calculations and also for the push-off calculations. So you need to use the constants that describe the specific energy versus the grit penetration depth curve. And if you've taken my course, you know what this is. If you don't know, we can just start with some suggested values for sharp, medium, dull. So let's just go with a sharp wheel. And a sharp wheel will give us certain values. We can change these if we want. We've got a sweet spot grit penetration depth. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then we have our primary outputs. Okay, so here is just kind of a summary of all the parameters. Here we have the top of the shoulder and the bottom of the shoulder, which we're not using, so we can ignore that. And then we have the parameters on the diameter. So in effect, we're plunging at 16.7 microns per second with an equivalent depth of 8 microns per cut. Our workpiece is going at 157 meters per second, millimeters per second. My wheel's going at 55 meters per second for an equivalent diameter of 23 millimeters. If you get that, great. If you don't worry about it. And here we have the arc length and some other things that are outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today. We can also look at this line here. So what we have is Q prime, and we have a Q prime on diameter of 1.31. So right there we can see the Q prime is 1.31. Now, is that a good number? Is that a bad number? Depends on what your goal is, what kind of material you're grinding. In the grinding course, I give some general values for what would be respectable for rough grinding. But you may want to do just kind of a survey of your parameters to see what's typical for you and then what your goals are. Again, I'm more of a believer in Q prime than I am in plunge feed rates. When I go to a company and they say, hey, I have a plunge feed rate of 1 millimeter per minute, is that good? I say, I have no idea. It really depends on what your wheel workpiece diameter is, your type of workpiece, whether you're doing roughing and finishing. But for this particular case, we got a Q prime of 1.31. We have a grit penetration depth of 1.57. Some people like grit penetration depth, some people like aggressiveness. They are analogous to each other. Here we have both, so that corresponds to an aggressiveness of 54. And that will give us a temperature of 413 degrees C, or an estimated temperature. And please take this with a grain of salt. Please be very careful with this. This depends a great deal on whether or not you have the right material properties, which we haven't put in yet, so we will put those in and that will change. And it depends a great deal on your specific energy versus aggressiveness, or specific energy versus grit penetration depth curve, which you don't know unless you've actually measured it. And I give you some estimates based on how sharp you dress the wheel. But hey, how sharp you dress the wheel, it's hard to quantify sharpness, so these values take with a grain of salt unless you have actually done the hard work of calculating the specific energy versus grit penetration depth curve. However, this temperature can be very useful in determining whether or not your temperature went up or down as you change the parameters. So if you change the parameters around and your temperature goes up or down, you can feel reasonably confident that that's probably what will happen. Your temperature will go up or your temperature will go down. But you can't be confident in that absolute temperature. You cannot be confident that, yes, your temperature is 413 degrees C. But if all of a sudden I crank up my workpiece from 120 RPM to 240 RPM, oh, look at that, my temperature came down. I will stand by that, but unless you know what that curve is, I will not stand by that it is exactly 336 degrees C. Okay. Now let's go down and put in some workpiece thermal properties. We know it's hardened steel. We don't know what kind of hardened steel it is. So we are going to use some suggested values from the Grinding Viking. And the Grinding Viking says some suggested values, high-speed steel. Here we are up at the top now. The Grinding Viking. Suggested values, high-speed steel 24. It actually varies within the family of high-speed steel. Cast iron 56. Most steels, not high-speed steels, but general steels. And here's where it gets a little complicated because high-speed steel is a steel. So please be careful. It's much better if you know what your thermal conductivity is of your workpiece, or what kind of workpiece material you have. But again, if you need some suggested values, here they are. Inconel's around 16, tungsten carbide around 70. Okay, so he says steel. Steels are around 43, so we're going to type that in here. Okay. Then we've got the workpiece density. The Grinding Viking gives you some suggested values. Most steels around 7850, not 14950. That's probably what we have left over from a carbide, so steel is not near as dense as carbide. 7850. We'll click here for some suggested values for workpiece specific heat capacity. Boom. Some suggested values, most steels around 480. So we're going to type that in. The cooling quality. Cooling has very, very little effect on temperatures in OD grinding. It's because the arc length is so small. Now it can have an effect on whether your grit's dull and load, but in just an absolute in terms of temperature, cooling has a minimal effect in OD grinding because of the arc length. It doesn't suck out a lot of heat. We don't care about the shoulder cooling quality. It's over down here. But we do care about the cooling quality on the diameter, and the grinding Viking says, this is an estimate of how well you are cooling. Knowing you, Joe, your cooling is probably way worse than you think it is. If you haven't done a bucket and stopwatch technique, and if you're not aiming well, I suggest you use a value of 1 for cooling. That's really not such bad advice because most OD grinding operations and cylindrical grinding have poor cooling. That's actually not that terrible of a situation, but. And then oil, water, or dry, we're going to go with water. That's pretty typical. We're not going to get into any of this, so if we look down here for displacement, push-off, hydroplaning, that's outside the scope of what I'm going to talk about here. As is a lot of this stuff about chatter. This is all about chatter risk here. We're not going to get into that. Okay. So there's where we're at, and right now we have a temperature of 435 degrees C. Again, I don't guarantee that that's not the right temperature because we don't know, we don't really have any idea what the specific energy curve is, but we're going to go with that for now. Okay. We have a Q prime of 1.3, a grit penetration depth of 1.57, and an aggressiveness of 54. So what we're going to do is we're going to type these values in and say, okay, this is our baseline. A grit penetration depth of 1.57. You could put in the aggressiveness if you wanted to. We can just leave these, put these to 0 because we're not interested in those. And then a temperature of 435 degrees C. Okay. So that's it. This is our baseline now. Are we doing well? Are we not doing well? Well, we're going to assume that we're doing reasonably well. We're not burning the workpiece. We're getting a decent cycle time. But maybe we've got some issues coming up, and we're going to see if we change parameters, what happens to that. Okay, so let's start with one easy thing to look at, and that is the waviness profile. If you've taken my course, you know that RPM over RPM, the mantra is round number bad, strange number good. If we click on this, we can get some advice from the grinding Viking. He talks about it here in our particular RPM ratio. We can see what the grinding Viking says up above, and the grinding Viking says an RPM ratio of 25.010006 2485869. Joe, that's so close to an integer value that your workpiece is sure to be unround and weirdly shaped, like your head. Okay, so the grinding Viking isn't very polite there. And sure enough, this is what our profile is going to look like. We're going to have, if we counted all these little red lobes, we would see 25 red lobes on the workpiece. And that's sparking out for 1 second. And you may think, well, that's okay. I'm going to spark out for 10 seconds. And if we do that, it's not really going to help much because we're so close to an integer. I can spark out for 20 seconds. It's not really going to help much. Okay. So what I need to do is get rid of that integer value, and the easy way to do that is either change the wheel speed or change the workpiece speed. Both will do the job. Both are fine. As long as we change one of them, we don't want to change both of them, or we don't want to change both of them the same amount. So let's see what happens if we go from 120 RPM, let's say, to 113 RPM. Now that's not a huge difference, 120 to 113. But if we do that, boom, look what happens to our waviness profile. We do much, much better. Here we spark out for 2 seconds, and we're practically down to nothing. Okay, so only 2 seconds, where previously we sparked out for, what was it, 10, 20 seconds, and it didn't have much of an effect. Now we spark out for a measly 2 seconds, so we don't have to deal with waviness. So there we are. Oh, 107, that's not good. We're not doing well with 107. Let's say we go to 115. 115 is not too great. How about 117? Hey, look at that. That's pretty good. And the grinding Viking says an RPM ratio of 25.65134613 other stuff. He says, Joe, you're getting kind of close to a fractional value of 2/3. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not great either. Well, let's go to 118 and see if that makes him happy. Oh, that's pretty good. An RPM ratio of 25.43, Joe, that's far away enough from an integer or fractional value that you'll probably be okay. And in fact, we don't even need to spark out that long to still do reasonably well. Okay, so that's not bad. Okay, so you get the idea. You can play around with that. We want to avoid integer values, so let's go for 117.5. Let's go for 118. All right, that's looking reasonable. Maybe we'll spark out for 2 seconds just to get that down a little bit better. Okay, so that's the waviness. Now, what happens if I increase my plunge velocity? Remember, our default grit penetration depth was 1.56 microns, 1.57, excuse me. We put that in right there. And my starting point was 435 degrees C. That's where we started at. And let's say we don't want to exceed that. So let's say we're doing reasonably well. And I don't want my temperature to go over 438 degrees C. Let's say I'm not burning, but I just don't want to go, I don't want to increase my risk of burn. Now, I don't know if my temperature is 438, but I do know I just don't want to increase temperature. So now let's see what happens if all we do is increase the plunge feed rate. Now, when people want to increase feed rates, or they want to drop cycle times, well, the first thing they do is just crank up feed rates, and let's see what happens. So let's say we go from 1 millimeter a minute to 1.5. That's a pretty good 50% increase. That's not a modest increase. If we do that, now look what happens to my Q prime. My Q prime has gone up to 1.96 when I increased it to 1.5. My grit penetration depth went from previous value of 1.57 to the new value of 1.73. Now you may say, well, wait, hold on. If I do that, my grit penetration depth is bigger, my aggressiveness is bigger, my grits are digging in deeper, they are doing more cutting and less rubbing, which is good, but the forces on the grits are increasing, and I'm probably going to get more wheel wear. Now we'll come back to that in a minute. What happens if what happens to my temperature? Well, my temperature, I increased the feed rate 50%, and look what happened to my temperature. It went from 435 degrees C to 563 degrees C, so we're higher than we were originally. Now, is that a problem? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, depending on how far away we are from burn, but it is higher than we had originally. Okay. But what happens if I decrease the feed rate to 0.5 millimeters a minute? Well, if I do that, now my Q prime is 0.65. My grit penetration depth has dropped to 1.31 microns, where previously it was 1.57. So you may think, well, that's pretty good. My grit penetration depth is smaller, so I'm probably going to get less wheel wear. But then again, I'm also going to get less self-sharpening of the wheel, poor self-sharpening. If I have an SG Cubitron quantum style wheel, he's not going to be as likely to microfracture those grits. And I'm going to do more rubbing and less cutting. Now, I will get a little bit better surface finish possibly, but we're doing rough grinding. We're not too worried about surface finish. And my temperature, lo and behold, is now lower. So that's what happens if I increase my feed rates or decrease my feed rate. Now, we're going to come back to that later. Let's go back to 1 millimeter a minute. And let's see what happens if I increase my workpiece RPM. Now, the first thing people do when they get burned is they slow down their workpiece RPM. So in fact, let's start with decreasing the workpiece RPM and see what happens. So when people get burned, they say, hey man, I got burned. I'm going to slow down that workpiece RPM because that's going to reduce the risk of burn. Now, if you've taken my course, I talk about this with great passion and great intensity about what you shouldn't do if you get burned. But maybe you forgot. Maybe you said, oh yeah, I took that grinding guy's course and I don't remember. Did he say I should increase my workpiece RPM or decrease my workpiece RPM? I can't remember. And actually, he even said it's different if I'm doing cylindrical plunge or cylindrical traverse, so it's even more complicated. Well, let's just plug it into the grinder's toolbox and see what happens. Okay, so we're at 118, we started at 120, we changed that a little bit to get rid of the waviness. Doesn't change much of anything else. So let's see what happens if I go from 120 or 118 RPM down to 60 RPM. So I'm going to decrease my workpiece RPM. If I do that, what's going to happen to all my other parameters? Well, if I decrease the workpiece RPM, my Q prime doesn't change because Q prime does not depend on RPM. My grit penetration depth gets smaller. Remember previously it was 1.57, now it's down to 1.32. If you take my course, you'll remember that we're moving from the fast and shallow region to the slow and deep region. Slow and deep has a longer arc length and we get more rubbing. Our grit penetration depth is smaller, our aggressiveness is smaller, but more importantly, our temperature has gone up. It's gone from 435 to 542. So all I did was decrease the workpiece RPM, and look what happened to my temperature. It went from 435 to 542. So back to our problem of waviness. We should probably, when we finalize that, change that a little bit, tweak it to get rid of that extra waviness. Okay. So now my temperature has gone up. Well, that's not good. Well, let's go back to 120. Now let's say I have burn, and let's say I'm getting burn, and you say, hey man, I remember I took that guy's grinding course, and he said if I get burn, I should increase the RPM, or was it decrease the RPM? I can't remember. Well, let's see what happens. If we're at 120 RPM and I go for 240 RPM, remember, our temperature is 435. What happens? Oh, now it's down to 354. So now I've got a lower temperature. So you may think, oh, that's good. If I speed that guy up, I'm going to get a lower temperature. But look what happened to my grit penetration depth and my aggressiveness. My grit penetration depth is now bigger. If my grit penetration depth is bigger, I'm going to get more wheel wear. Maybe that's a problem, maybe that's not a problem, but I have to be aware of what happens. Okay. Let's go back to 120. So let's say I've got too much wheel wear. And I've got some kind of form on my wheel, some kind of radius, and I don't want that radius to break down as quickly. Well, the first thing I can do is say, okay, well, I am going to increase the RPM to reduce wheel wear. And what happens to grit penetration depth? It goes from 1.57 to 1.74, and it actually gets bigger. And you say, oh man, that's right, I want to decrease the RPM. I want to go from 120 down to, let's say, 60. If I do that, my grit penetration depth gets smaller. Hey, that's good. Now I'm going to get less wheel wear. But, oh, look what happens to temperature. It's gone up. That's bad. I'm going to get higher temperature. So I need to be aware of that okay, I can reduce that wheel wear very easily just by dropping the workpiece RPM. But what's going to happen to temperature? Same thing, I can crank this guy up. If I want really low temperatures, let's crank him up to 300 RPM. Oh, now my temperature drops. Hey, that's great. But look what happens to my grit penetration depth. It gets monster size. And I'm going to chew up my wheel and wear it away quickly. Okay. So let's go back to our starting point and let's just look at one final little exercise. And this is a common one. I do this all the time to say, okay, I want to increase feed rates, but I don't want anything bad to happen. Okay. So here's my default. My default is 120 RPM. Yes, that's bad for waviness, but we'll deal with that later. That's usually the last thing we deal with because we just got to tweak that a little bit to get rid of that integer value. And we say, all right, I am going to increase my feed rate, but I don't want anything bad to happen. Okay, well, if all we do is increase the feed rate, let's say to 1.4 millimeters a minute, hey, that's a 40% increase. That's pretty damn good. But if I do that, what happens to my grit penetration depth? It gets bigger. If my grit penetration depth gets bigger, I'm going to wear away my wheel more quickly. That's not good. I'm going to get a rougher surface finish, slightly, not huge, but slightly. Maybe it doesn't matter because it's rough grinding, but still. And my temperature is going to get bigger. Then you may think, okay, well, let me think about this. Is there a way I can increase that feed rate and keep the temperature the same or close to the same, and get the grit penetration depth the same or close to the same? Well, I've got too high a temperature. I don't like that. So I know if I want to reduce temperature, I can increase the RPM. And you can say, hey, look at that. When I increase the RPM, well, now my temperature is coming down and I'm almost back down to 435. Not quite, I'm close, but look what happens to my grit penetration depth. Well, that's not good. Now, what other parameters do I have to work with? Other parameters I have to work with are not going to change the diameter, not going to change, I've already changed the RPM, I've already changed the plunge speed. Can't really change the wheel diameter, I'm stuck with whatever I've got. But maybe, depending on your machine, you can probably change the wheel speed. And as long as you stay within the maximum safe rating of the wheel, let's see if we can speed this guy up. Now we probably want to dress before, if we do end up speeding it up, we want to dress, but we're just getting some parameters now. So what happens if I speed up the wheel? Well, some of the old-time machinists will know immediately. If you speed up the wheel, your wheel will act harder, and that is because the grit penetration depth gets smaller, but the temperature will probably go up. So let's say I go to 70 meters per second. Well, now my temperature is up to 500 degrees C, higher than 435, but my grit penetration depth is now coming back down. How can I deal with that? Well, let's take it up to, let's say, 75. Let's assume that that's within the maximum safe rating. Oh, now my temperature is higher than I want it to be, but not drastically, and my grit penetration depth is a little bit higher than I want it to be. So we're probably not going to pull this off by keeping the same both grit penetration depth and temperature. In fact, if we keep the same grit penetration depth and temperature, it's going to be hard to grind at higher feed rates without sacrificing one of those. What if we went just a modest 20% faster? Well, let's say we did that, and we said, okay, I've got a little room to play with. My grit penetration depth is 1.56, that's close enough to 1.57. My temperature is a little bit higher at 435 compared to 461, and that's not drastic. Maybe I can get away with that. Let's drop the wheel speed a little bit. Oh, now my temperature is pretty close to what I had originally. Not too bad. My grit penetration depth is a little bit higher. And now I've got to decide, okay, it looks like I'm not going to be able to have everything. But if I still want to increase my feed rates, what can I do? And then you have to make a decision to say, okay, the biggest concern I have is wheel wear. If the biggest concern you have is wheel wear, and you can tolerate higher temperatures, well, let's choose some parameters that give me somewhat higher temperatures, but not higher wheel wear. If my biggest concern is temperature and burn, but I can tolerate a higher grit penetration depth and a little more wheel wear, or maybe a lot more wheel wear, then let's do that. So let's go back to, let's say, 1.4 millimeters a minute. And I'm going to say, okay, I cannot tolerate higher burn. I've got to get that burn down however I do it. So I'm going to crank up that workpiece RPM to 220 RPM. I'm getting a little bit too high there. Let's say I slow that wheel down to 65. Now we're getting closer. Now we're down to 60. We're getting closer. Maybe that was a little too ambitious because we're not quite there yet. So why don't we go to 1.3. Now I'm back to 435, so hey, I don't have any bigger risk of burn. My temperature stayed the same, Now again, I don't know if the temperature is 435. I can just tell you whether your burn risk is higher or lower. But my grip penetration depth is now quite a bit higher, so that's going to mean more wheel wear. Now sometimes in rough grinding you say, hey, I don't care about too much wheel wear because maybe I don't have a complex form on the wheel, or even if I do, maybe my wheel wear is just not a big bottleneck for me, and I can tolerate more wheel wear. If that's the case, then hey, we've got a 30% faster feed rate, we have a very nice waviness profile, and I don't have any negative repercussions going on. So that's one option. Another option is to say, okay, well, what if temperature is not my bottleneck? What if grip penetration depth is my bottleneck? Let's go back to our starting. So I go from 1 to 1.3 and I say, hey, I can tolerate higher temperatures, but I cannot tolerate a higher grip penetration depth. I don't want to get any more wheel wear. Well, if that's the case, then look what this, when I increased the feed rate, and I kept everything else the same, the original was 120. When I did that, my temperature went from 435 to 512. Say, okay, that's a higher temperature, but I'm not too worried about burn. But I've got 1.57 microns, and now I'm up to 1.68, and you say, oh, well, that isn't good. I don't want to have bigger grip penetration depth because I'm going to get more wheel wear. So I say, okay, well, I can do two things. I can mess around with the workpiece velocity, and I can mess around with the wheel speed. Maybe the max wheel speed I can go is 60. If I do that, boom, my grip penetration depth comes down a little bit. Well, that helps me. My temperature goes up a little bit, but I'm not too worried about that. I slow down my workpiece to 100 RPM. Boom. Oh, now my grip penetration depth is even lower than it was before. My temperature's gone up from 435 to 552. Let's try 105. Let's try 110. Oh, now I'm back to my original grip penetration depth. That's good. And I've got a temperature that is a fair bit higher, but not terrible. Because I have a higher material removal rate for the same grip penetration depth. But as we said in the beginning, hey, I'm not worried about temperature. My bottleneck is grip penetration depth. Okay. So the point of all this is to say you can play around with all these different parameters and then see what works for you. What do you want to control? What happens? Is there anything surprising going on? If I change 5 parameters at once, what's going to happen? Now, real quick, let's look at what happens if I change the dressing from sharp to medium. Now again, these are all very arbitrary. I've just pulled these out, but these are somewhat arbitrary parameters. Because how do you define sharp? How do you define medium? But just going from sharp to medium, look at what happens to my temperature. My temperature goes from 536 degrees C to 641 degrees C. Okay, that's a fair bit of a difference. So we could mess around, we could go dull, we could go very dull, but you get the idea. If you take my grinding course, you're going to learn that the biggest cause of burn in cylindrical grinding is dressing dull. I'm a big fan of dressing sharp, changing the grit size if you need to, but you want to stay away from dull dress. Okay. So that is an introduction to these parameters. Again, there's a whole nother section here on chatter, chatter risk, cutting stiffness, wavelength obliteration versus via scalloping, wavelength attenuation to help you with your chatter risk, displacement, especially for ID, that's important, and that's a big cause of taper. You might call it barreling. It's more in cylindrical traverse, but some people do. Bell mouth shaped, things like that. Okay. It also talks about deflection due to cooling, which is not insignificant, but that's outside the course, outside the scope of what we're going to discuss here. Okay, so play around with some of these, see what works, see what happens. It can be very useful when changing a diameter. If all of a sudden I go from 25 millimeters to 100 millimeters, boom, everything's going to change drastically. I'm going to get super high temperatures, and I'm going to have to slow down my feed rate. But if I slow down my feed rate and I don't change anything else, I'm still going to have pretty high temperatures, and I'm still going to have high grit penetration depths, and I've got to mess around with wheel speed and workpiece velocity. It can be a very useful starting point for saying, okay, well, I've got everything was going well at 25 millimeter diameter. What happens if all of a sudden I get a part at 100 millimeters of diameter? How do I cope with that? Okay. So that's it for case study 1. All right, let's take a look at case study number 2, which I call keeping GPD, grit penetration depth, constant. So this is an actual case study with real values I pulled from a company I visited probably 8 years ago that was doing tungsten carbide grinding. And they were grinding some kind of steel shaft, and they were putting a radius in it. And they were putting a whole bunch of radii, in these various shafts. It was just a simple radius plunging straight down, no traverse, nothing like that, just plunging straight down. And they wanted to increase their feed rates, but they were not able to. Okay, so here are the basics of the process. Their wheel diameter was 393.7 millimeters. They had a diamond wheel, 320 mesh metal bond diamond wheel that was rotating at 1306 RPM, or 27 meters per second. Now in this particular case, we don't get into waviness. I don't know if that's an RPM ratio or not. We could check if we wanted to. We were plunging in at 1 millimeter a minute in a tungsten carbide shaft. The workpiece diameter was 22.225 millimeters. And they were doing okay with this. Now, I'm not going to fire it up in the grinder's toolbox. If you'd like to, you can. I am just sort of, shouldn't say the grinder's toolbox, the Cylindrical Master 2020. But I did put it all the results here. Okay, so let's start with the default. The default was set number 1, I call it, and we have plunging 100 millimeters a minute. The workpiece was rotating at 250 RPM. The wheel was going at 1306 RPM. And we put those in with the properties for tungsten carbide, and we make some assumptions about the sharpness of the wheel, the amount of loading. So I can't tell you if this temperature is accurate, but I can tell you that if the temperature goes up or goes down, that should be reasonably accurate whether it goes up or down. When we do that, we had a Q prime of 1.16 square millimeters per second, a grit penetration depth of 1.46 microns, temperature of 118 degrees C. The spindle power was 1.5 kilowatts. There was a certain width in this. We didn't include that in the diagram here. And the displacement, this is what's calculated in the grinder's toolbox. So the grinding power is what's calculated in the Cylindrical Master 2020. Along with the displacement, we had to make an estimate of the stiffness again. We don't outside the scope of this short video, but the displacement was around 26 microns when we were plunging down. So they were doing fine and good, and everything was good with this. Okay. And I said to the operator said to me, he goes, "Hey man, I want to increase the feed rate, but I'm unable to do it. If I increase the feed rate, I'll chew up my wheel, I will lose form, and I'll have to go back and true the wheel." So I said, okay, well let's plug these into the Cylindrical Master 2020. If we do that and we plunge in at 2 millimeters a minute instead of 1, so that's doubling the feed rate. That's quite ambitious. If we do that and we keep the same RPM, the same workpiece RPM, the same wheel RPM, I probably should have made that 1306, the same everything except for just plunging in faster, my grit penetration depth will go to 1.73 microns. My temperature go up a little bit, that's a calculation. My power will go up, my displacement will go up, and he said, hey, that's a bad idea, it's not going to work, I'm going to end up chewing up my wheel. I said, okay, I believe you. I mean, you know your process better than I do. So I believe you, I take your word for it. I said, so let's do this. You're worried about chewing up your wheel. You're not worried about temperatures. You're worried about chewing up your wheel. So let's say we keep that 2 millimeters a minute, but then we mess around in the grinder's toolbox. Whoops. We mess around in the grinder's toolbox and we decrease the workpiece RPM to 150 RPM. Remember, decreasing the RPM will give me a smaller grit penetration depth. And then we played around with the RPM, we played around with the wheel speed. We ended up cranking the wheel speed up from 1306 RPM to 1383 RPM. Not a huge increase, but a modest increase. Our Q prime doubles, because we've doubled our plunge speed from 1.16 to 2.33. And when we do that, when we adjusted those, we got more or less the same grit penetration depth, 1.46 to 1.48 microns. They're doing construction next door. I hear a lot of banging, so hopefully that's not making its way too bad into the microphone. Now, I said, okay, and we ran that. We ran it, and it worked just fine. And the operator said, man, look at that. We're doing just fine. I'm not chewing up my wheel like I worried about. I said, yeah, you didn't chew up your wheel, because if you're a little diamond on that wheel, you're still plunging about 1.46 microns, 1.46, 1.48, pretty close. And we said, hey, well, let's keep going. Let's double it again. Now we're going to go to 4 millimeters a minute. And I said, all right, well, we can try it. I'm getting a little nervous now about temperatures and other things, but we can try it. But if we do, we've got to change some other parameters. We're going to have to drop the workpiece RPM. We're going to have to increase the wheel RPM, and we can play around with those, whatever amount we want, to try to get the same grit penetration depth. And we got pretty close, 1.46, 1.5, not a drastic difference. Now the theoretical temperature went up to 347, but again, that wasn't our biggest issue. We weren't cracking tungsten carbide workpieces due to temperature. Our biggest issue was chewing up the big grit penetration depth. So we ran that, and it worked just fine. And the operator said, man, look at that. We're going at 4 times the feed rate. That's amazing. I said, well, let's keep going. And I said, hey, man, there's going to be a limit eventually, because temperatures are going up. We can't avoid that. Displacement's going up. We can't avoid that. Spindle power's going up. We can't avoid that. And he said, hey, man, let's try 6 millimeters a minute. So we did that. We dropped it down to 90 RPM based on my calculation in the Cylindrical Master 2020. We sped the wheel up to 1824 RPM, and the operator said, man, I usually go at 1300. Now we're at 1800. That just seems kind of crazy. We've got a whopping Q prime of 7, which is kind of obscene for carbide grinding, but we were just messing around. Our grit penetration depth stayed about the same. Now we're still at 1.46, 1.5, 1.49, somewhere in that ballpark. My temperature is getting higher. This is my theoretical temperature, but temperature is not our issue. Our issue is big grit penetration depth causing our wheel to break down. And our grit penetration depth stayed the same, so if you're a little grit on the wheel, your life hasn't really changed much. Now granted, you're entering and exiting more frequently, but you're entering and exiting at the same grit penetration depth. And when we ran this one, workpiece started to grind, and then all of a sudden the wheel stalled. It was outside the power rating of the wheel. I don't remember what that was, but my calculated power was 8.9 kilowatts. Maybe the motor was only rated for 8 kilowatts. So the safety feature kicked in and said, hey, you're pulling too many amps. My wheel can't handle this, and it cut out. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, okay, fair enough. We knew we were eventually going to reach our limits. But the limit was the power of the wheel and not chewing up that wheel due to a big grit penetration depth. Okay. And I said, well, hey, man, if you want to go back to 4, you could probably get away with it. I'm a little nervous about temperatures and carbide. If you want to go to 2, I'm pretty confident you could do a long run with that, which is what he ended up doing. And he didn't chew up the wheel, obviously, because it's 1.48 microns. Kept that the same. And I said, but will you just humor me? I want to know what will happen if we increase the feed rate to 4 millimeters a minute, but we kept everything else the same. So, and that's typically what people do when they crank up feed rates. They say, okay, I'm going to crank up the feed rate, maybe not to 4, that's a bit extreme, but I'm going to keep the same workpiece RPM, the same wheel speed, because that's what people typically do. They just change one thing and crank it up. And I said, well, let's just do that and see what happens. And when we did, yeah, granted, we had the higher Q prime that worked before. It worked just fine here. But we kept all the other parameters the same. The grip penetration depth now is a monstrous 2.06 microns. That's a lot bigger than the original 1.46. And what happened? The operator ground 1 part, and 1 part is not a lot in carbide grinding when you true your wheel every 150 parts, every 600 parts, something like that. So he had catastrophic wheel wear just in 1 part. And he had to go back and retrue the wheel. And why is that? Because he didn't keep the grip penetration depth constant. It kept getting bigger, bigger, bigger. And when you have a bigger grip penetration depth, you're going to suffer the consequences. Possibly, in this case we did, because we were chewing up our wheel. Okay. So my point of this is not to say, hey, I want you to crank up your feed rates, and I want you to change your wheel speed, and I want you to change your wheel speed. My point of this is you can use the Cylindrical Master 2020 to play around, see what happens. Well, what if I do this? Well, what if I do this? And you can spend 10 minutes playing around in your program and then go out and try it on your machine, and you're far more likely to have success if you've done that exercise before. It's going to cost you 10 minutes of your life. But if you can crank up feed rates from 1 millimeter a minute, even to a modest 2, not to 4, but to a modest 2, and you've got to do 1 million of these little radiuses in the next month, that is a pretty major cycle time, and certainly worth 10 minutes of your life. Okay? Or if your issue is you're worried about temperature, play around with this, see what happens. If you're worried about wheel wear, play around with this, see what happens. My goal is not to tell you what to do. My goal is just to give you a tool, and it's up to you to figure out how you want to use that tool to achieve whatever you want to achieve. Okay, the next case study, the last case study, is going to involve wheel swivel. It's common in a lot of cylindrical grinding operations to swivel your wheel 30 degrees. I wrote a grinding dot column on this last month, how just swiveling even a few degrees can work wonders. I mean, is miraculous in what it can do to help deal with burn on the shoulder, even in ID grinding. So here we have a situation on the left. So we're going to start on the one on the left, where we've swiveled the wheel 30 degrees and we're plunging in also at 30 degrees. So there's the swivel angle beta and then the feed angle alpha, and they can be different. In some machines you're not able to change them, in some machines you can. So in this case we've got a wheel going at 55 meters per second. We're plunging at 2 millimeters a minute. On the diameter, we have a diameter that is 20 millimeters, and then the shoulder continues up to 30 millimeters. So we have a very different situation on the diameter, on the bottom of the shoulder, and at the top of the shoulder. Okay, and as we plug these into the Cylindrical Master, what we will see is we have a Q prime of 1.6 here, 1.0 there, 1.8 there, so it's different on the shoulder because of that 30 degrees. The grip penetration depth is vastly different, so you can plug these in. The grip penetration depth on the OD is 1.89 microns. The grip penetration depth on the bottom of the shoulder is only 0.67, so this is vastly different. Right here, the grits are penetrating 1.9 microns, and over here, they're penetrating only 0.67 microns. Now, that changes things, because what happens is the grits on the shoulder are rubbing a lot, generating a lot of heat, giving us a bigger risk of burn over there, giving us poor self-sharpening. And on the OD, they're digging in deep, so we may get excess of wheel wear on the OD. We'll get very little wheel wear on the shoulder, but we will have a lot of rubbing, a bigger risk of burn, poor self-sharpening. And how do we cope with that? Okay, now for this particular exercise, we're going to look at, okay, what happens if instead of using a 20 millimeter diameter workpiece, we switch to a 100 millimeter diameter workpiece? Now, let's assume that in this particular situation, everything's looking good. We like our parameters. We don't have too much burn. We don't have too much wheel wear. Everything is looking good. And then we switch over and we go 5 times the workpiece diameter. So some people may think, well, I'm going from 20 millimeters on my diameter to 100 millimeters in my diameter. Therefore, I've got 5 times the stock removal. So instead of going at 2 millimeters a minute, I should go at 1/5 of that, or 0.4 millimeters a minute. Okay. And to complicate things, let's say that my wheel diameter, after grinding for a while, is no longer 350 millimeters, but 275 millimeters. So we're going to plug these values in. We're going to play around with a little bit. I could play around with this for 2 hours. But I've already spent far more time than I planned on this video, so we're going to keep it short. But what you may want to do is plug in these values and then play around with different feed rates, different plunge angles if that's possible for you, different wheel speeds, whoops, and things like that to see how you can manipulate that. Okay, so let's fire up the Cylindrical Master 2020 and see what happens when we plug these values in. So here we have the Cylindrical Master 2020. Let's plug in the values that we had. We are going to not do inner diameter, we're going to do outer diameter grinding. And as we showed in the previous slide, we're plunging in at 2 millimeters a minute. My workpiece is going at 120 RPM. The diameter on the OD is 20 millimeters, and then the shoulder goes up to 30 millimeters. The width of the diameter, we don't really need to mess with because that's more for chatter. So we've got 10, so we're going to leave that. The wheel diameter right now is 350 millimeters. The wheel's going at 55 millimeters per second, and if you want to know what RPM that is, it gives it to you right here. That corresponds to 3001.2 RPM. Now we have an 80 mesh wheel, so this is an American style mesh style, not an FEPA. And we've got a swivel of 30 degrees and we're plunging at 30 degrees. Now we can't switch those. We could swivel at 30 and plunge at 45. We could plunge at 89 if we wanted to. But we're going to go 30-30, which is pretty typical. We've got aluminum oxide, and I'm going to assume my wheel is sharp. Okay, so here's where we're at, and if we do that, we have 3 different outputs here. We have the shoulder, which I have as the green box that points to the top of the shoulder. We have the bottom of the shoulder. There's usually not a huge difference between these two unless your shoulder is super high. And then we have the value on the diameter. So in this particular case, the shoulder has a Q prime of 1.6, the top, the bottom of the shoulder 1.0, and then the OD, the diameter is 1.81. The grip penetration depth is 1.82, 0.67 and 1.89. So let's put those values in here. So those are our reference values, and those are working reasonably well. So we're just going to type those in as our reference values. Aggressiveness is 11, 7, and 62. So you take a look at that. Our aggressiveness on the OD is 62, but on the shoulder it's only 7.9. That's a huge difference. So what that means is the grits on the shoulder are going to rub. They're not going to self-sharpen well. They're going to be more prone to having a high specific energy and a high heat. And then the ones on the OD, even though the material move rate's higher, the grits are penetrating deeper, they're going to rub less, cut more. And the temperature, what we went for sharp. We don't know if it's sharp. Could be anything, but I'm going to go with sharp. Or maybe we could go with medium. Either way would be okay, because we're really more interested in relative values and not absolute values. We've got a steel workpiece, so I'm going to go 43.7850. I'm going to go shoulder cooling quality is poor, because it almost always is. And so we've got a medium wheel. Here we have 443, 392, and 659. Now, I don't know if it's really 659. If it is, we're starting to get into the region where we're going to get residual tensile stresses and possibly rehardening. But we're just going to go with that for now. And I'm going to type in these values as our reference point. All right, now the exercise said, hey, we're doing fine with this. Everything is going well. We don't have burn that we're aware of. We don't have excess of wheel wear. Everything is going good. And then the operator comes along and says, okay, I'm not going to have a 20 millimeter diameter workpiece. I'm going to go for 100 millimeters. And I'm going to go 110 on the shoulder, and then my wheel diameter has now decreased to 275 millimeters, but I'm maintaining that constant speed of 55 millimeters per second. Now notice what happened there. I went from having a lot of waviness to no waviness simply because when that wheel diameter got smaller, the RPM increased. Now it's up to 3,800, as you can see here. And we are outside an integer value. So that is an issue in my customer space. I had a customer in Spain some years ago who had a major issue with this, where they were passing in and out of integer values as their wheel diameter got smaller. Okay, so here's where we're at now. But what we did was we said, hey, we're no longer going to go at 2 millimeters a minute. We're going to go at 0.4. So I've got the same Q prime. Remember when we started, my Q prime was at 1.6 and now it's at 1.2, so that's not right. 0.4, I've got a 100 millimeter diameter. Well, that's right, that's 110. That's a little different. Yeah, 1.0, but I've got on the OD, I've got the same Q prime as 1.8. So the Q prime on the OD has stayed the same. And if you did nothing else but this, well, this would be a starting point, because you would say, hey, my diameter is 5 times bigger, so I'm going to go at 1/5 the speed, and you'd probably get away with it. Because look what happened. Previously, my grip penetration depth on the shoulder was 0.82, but now it's at 1.12, so it's actually bigger than it was previously. Now that's a little bit odd, because I've got a bigger workpiece but a smaller plunge speed. So you'd think multiply by 5, divide by 5, that would give me the same, but it changes things. It went from 0.82 to 1.12. So I'm bigger over here. I went from 0.67 to 1.06, so that's bigger also. And my grip penetration depth went 1.89 to 2.0, so that got bigger. So I'm going to get more wheel wear. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I don't know. But look what happened to my temperature. My temperature went from 443 down to 248. It went from 392 down to 244. And it went from 659 down to 366. So look at that. My temperature is far lower than it was previously, but I've got a bigger grip penetration depth. And if I ran with this, well, my risk for burn would be less because I've got lower temperatures, but my risk for wheel wear would be higher because I've got bigger grip penetration depth. Is that a problem? Well, it depends on your grinding operation. If wheel wear is an issue, we should deal with that. If burn is an issue, we'd deal with that. But remember, I said we were doing pretty well with these parameters. So we've got some room to play with. And what that means is that I've got room to play with temperature, because I've got a far lower temperature. So maybe what I'll say is, hey, look at that. I don't have to cut it down by a factor of 5. Why don't I go to 0.6 millimeters a minute? Now my Q prime is bigger across the board. My temperatures are going up because that's what's going to happen, but still they're far lower than they were previously. However, I now have much bigger grit penetration depth. If I want to reduce that grit penetration depth, what can I do? Drop my workpiece velocity. Let's go with 80. Now all of a sudden my grit penetration depth is coming down, but my temperatures are going up. We're still way below what we were previously, from 659 down to 531, 443 down to 354, so we're doing pretty well, but my grit penetration depths are still higher than they were originally. Well, let's take this guy down to 60 then. If I go at 60 RPM, my grit penetration depth should be coming down, and they are, not what they were originally. This one is now lower, but these are not, and my temperatures are still lower. Now, if I wanted to get fancy, I could say, well, look at this. My grit penetration depths on the outer diameter are about what they were, but my grit penetration depth on the shoulder is still bigger. So if I wanted to, I could change that direction of plunge. Instead of going at 30 degrees, go at 40, go at 20, depending on the stock removal I have too, to try to get something more optimum. But I've still got room to play with temperature. So let's do this. Let's drop this guy to 50 RPM. You typically rotate bigger workpieces slower anyway. And now things are getting down. My temperatures are coming up. Maybe I can go to 0.65 here. Now my temperatures are getting closer to, ooh, look at this. Now on the sidewall, they're actually a little bit bigger on the bottom of the shoulder than they were originally. Okay, so let's go back to 0.6. That's still 50% higher than what I had originally, but I want to get that grit penetration depth down on the shoulders. So what I can do is, well, maybe I won't plunge at 30 degrees. I could plunge at 40 degrees. And we'll do that next. However, if we did nothing else but this and left it where we're at right now, maybe even slowed it down to 40 RPM, my temperature is now about what it was originally, a little bit higher here and a little bit higher there, but not too bad. A little bit lower on the OD. My grit penetration depths are pretty close. They're actually lower on the OD, higher on the shoulder, but usually the grit penetration depth on the shoulder is lower than we want it to be. And if I ran with these parameters right here, I would probably be just fine. My risk of burn isn't higher except for on the bottom of the shoulder. Maybe I could crank that back up to 50 to bring that down. So now we've got some parameters that are pretty close to what we had originally, and we could probably get away with it just fine, and we're also grinding 50% faster than we were when we started. Now, I could spend another 10 minutes playing around with various parameters to try to get this just right. I could play with RPM, I could play with wheel speed too, to try to get some of the grit penetration depths down. I could play with plunge speed, and you certainly should do that, but I've already gone way over my time that I'd like to. So we're going to leave it at that just to show you what you can mess around with to try to get the parameters that you want that'll give you something reasonable and also give you a shorter cycle time than you had originally. We've got a 50% faster feed rate. But if we want to get fancy, we could say, okay, I've got a little room to play with on the OD. I could make my temperature higher. I could make my grit penetration depth higher, and I'd like to make my grit penetration depth on the shoulder lower. So let's change the feed angle, and instead of feeding at 30 degrees, let's feed at, well, which direction do I want to go? Do I want to go bigger or smaller? I think I want to go smaller. So I could do that. Now the grit penetration depths on the shoulder are getting smaller. The grit penetration depth on the diameter is getting bigger, and I've still got a little bit of room to play with on the diameter. So I could do that, maybe speed this guy up. Let's see, what do I want to do? I could speed him up to get the temperature down. That's not really what I want to do. What if we went to 15 degrees? Now our temperature is about what it was originally there. It's much lower there. It's much lower there, so it's about the same on the OD, but quite a bit lower on the shoulders. And then my grip penetration depth is about the same, a little bit higher, and about the same, slightly lower. So I could get away with this just fine without really any bigger risk of burn. However, my biggest risk of burn appears to come on the OD and not the shoulder. So you could argue I could plunge more into the shoulder and get away with it, depending on what my limitations are. So I'm going to stop here because I can get crazy with this and spend an hour on it talking about all the options and really fine-tuning it. But what I want to show you here is 10 minutes, and already we've got some parameters that are better than what we had originally and at a 50% faster feed rate, with no increased risk of burn and no increased risk of increased wheel wear, or just generally bad things are happening. Okay, and we've got a good waviness profile. So I would encourage you to, if you have the Grinder's Toolbox, or when you get it, if you decide it's for you, play around with it. We spent 10 minutes on it and we've already made some pretty good progress. Once you get familiar with it, you can really manipulate things to get your cycle times down, deal with excess wheel wear, deal with high temperatures, or whatever really the bottleneck is in your grinding operation. Okay, so that is a description of the Cylindrical Master 2020, and that is a description of how you can use it, where you could use it, what operations you can use it, how it can benefit you. You can get a copy of that by either during COVID times taking my one-day cylindrical Zoom course. I don't know if we're going to continue that after COVID, but as of now, we are doing a one-day Zoom course, and then if you take the course, you get a copy of the Cylindrical Master 2020, and then we talk about using it, and then in addition we talk much greater detail about all the concepts of aggressiveness, maximum chip thickness, Q prime, temperatures, maintaining the same aggressiveness to avoid problems, dealing with too much wheel wear, chatter, burn, and then making those calculations in the Cylindrical Master 2020, where it does it for you, and then we can say, okay, has the temperature gone up or down? And we get into details more about the fundamental concepts behind that, so you can have a good understanding of what's going on with those concepts. After Zoom, we're going to resume the 3-day high-intensity grinding course. We've got one scheduled for Sweden in, I think it was September, October, so hopefully COVID will be mostly behind us at that point. And then we've got 2 other courses on hold that will hopefully resume. So if you take one of those, you'll get the Cylindrical Master 2020, and there you will get very much in-depth into grinding, and you will get a very fundamental, good understanding of the concepts that go into the waviness calculations, the Q prime, and everything else. Okay. I'm very honest with my customers. If a customer wants to purchase something from me, for example, Cylindrical Master 2020 or the grindometer, and I don't think they will benefit, I tell them, I say, no, I'm not going to sell you this because I don't think it'll be useful. So in the case of the grindometer, I just say, no, I'm not going to sell you this because, number one, you're doing a type of grinding that's not conducive to having the grindometer benefit you. Or number two, I say, listen, you just don't know enough about grinding. I mean, the grindometer is not an idiot box. You have to understand some basic concepts of grinding in order to use it. And if you don't have a decent basic understanding of that, it's not going to help you. It's going to be garbage in, garbage out, and you're going to stand there and say, hey, I got a signal, but what do I do with that signal? So I have said to several people or several companies, no, I'm not going to sell you the same thing. I'm not going to sell you the grindometer. And the same thing with the Cylindrical Master 2020. If you don't know anything about grinding and you're just hoping to buy something, punch in a bunch of numbers and it'll tell you what to do, you either won't improve things or you'll make things worse. So you have to have an understanding of that. But if you do have a basic understanding of grinding and you use that and use it carefully, then it'll work wonders for you in terms of reducing cycle time, dealing with day-to-day issues of chatter, burn, trying to get cycle times up without bad things happening, waviness, and just generally small little headaches that pop up all the time. Instead of having those small little headaches come up and you say, oh, let's just shoot in the dark and trial and error and see what happens. Now you will have a tool that you can use to come up with some ideas that should help you solve the issue. Okay. So that is it. If you're interested, visit www.thegrindingdoc.com, doc, D-O-C. And good luck. I hope to see you at my high intensity grinding course or one of my Zoom courses.